all of you. So we have a lot of folks here today. Some are parents, caregivers, family, friends, professionals, community members, neurodivergent folks themselves, or a mix of any and all of those. And welcome to all of you. We also have future viewers that we don't know yet, and I wanted to say welcome to all of you as well. Feel free to reach out to WarmLine at warmlinefrc.org if you have any questions. And now I am super excited today to welcome Dr. Alex Klein. So Dr. Alex Klein, Psy.D, is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in parenting, as well as assessing neurodivergent adults and children. He currently runs a private practice in Oakland, California. His primary interests include neurodiversity-affirming care, parenting challenging children, pathological demand avoidance, or PDA, social justice, trauma, education, and advocating for the rights of children. Dr. Klein's greatest joys are spending time with his family and friends, music, and exploring the outdoors with his wife and twin daughters in the Bay Area. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Klein to discuss neuro-affirming parenting in early childhood.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you to WarmLine, Anya, Jen, all of you. Really appreciate you inviting me to be here. It's really a delight. I love the name WarmLine. It just feels so inviting. And clearly the personalities of those of you involved are so inviting. And so thank you for the resources you give to your community. Thank you for inviting me into your community. I come to you not terribly far. I'm in Oakland, California. I know that I think I heard that WarmLine was based in Sacramento, but you also work with surrounding counties. So this is wonderful to hear. And today the topic is neuro-affirming parenting in early childhood. This is I'll just give you a little background on me and this topic briefly. Um, and then again, as Christina said, I would sort of encourage anyone to put any comments or questions into the chat if they come up for you and you want to, engage the chat function that way. I won't be seeing those questions until the end. And I think by around 12:15, we're going to try to start the kind of a Q&A discussion component. But again, you're welcome to share any thoughts or questions before that. So this is a topic, that's been sort of near and dear to my heart for a long time. My background, this is now pushing 25 years ago, was actually sort of a home-based therapist working with kids diagnosed on the spectrum or with other kinds of developmental disabilities. That was, at first for me, it was an ABA program. Later, I went to work into sort of a DIR floor time program, and I'm going to talk about that kind of approach in a little bit here. A little later in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So I kind of pivoted from sort of a behavioral kind of home-based program working in that world to a DIR floor time model, which is a very different approach and vibe. I later actually became one of my first jobs out of college, besides doing the home-based work, was actually at an early intervention center in Brooklyn, New York. So I was working with the real little ones. I think as young as it was like 18 months to 4 years old, I think was the range they had there. Working with the really, really little ones, which I really liked doing a lot. I later kind of pivoted into working in an elementary school. It's also kids with a range of diagnoses. Mostly autism is sort of an autism school, but actually in practice we had all kinds of kids in the classroom. So I was sort of a teacher for a while. I think for me, I kind of came to realize that even though I loved kids and I loved getting to know families and I loved some of the more spontaneous aspects of being a teacher, I think as I realized that my own sort of executive functioning challenges actually made being the kind of teacher I wanted to be quite difficult. And so I actually kind of pivoted, went to grad school, moved out to California. And, since then, range of work, but as Christina said, I mean, I'm mostly doing child and adult assessment for neurodivergence. And I really kind of am now doing quite a wide range. Like I think I have kids as young as 2 or 3 that I'm assessing, but I also have older adults. So it's been a really interesting experience. And then I also work with parents to support parents, parent counseling. That's sort of the most of what I do is around those activities. And whenever I'm lucky enough to be invited into these communities, I of course really jump on that opportunity, and I really love this. When I was getting my doctorate, I really, and as I said, I had this sort of background in working in the field of neurodivergence prior to that. Um, I became quite interested in sort of the what at the time was sort of a really an increasing um, visibility of neurodivergent folks with disabilities, adults largely who were kind of sharing their experiences and opinions about therapies, about clinicians, sharing their views. So my dissertation really centered on it was specifically to young adults who had kind of had a diagnosis early on, who had been through treatment, that were able to share their views with me in some way. It was a qualitative dissertation, really kind of changed me, I think, sort of my ideas about sort of what it means to be a neuro-affirming practitioner, um, and what being neuro-affirming really means, because I really got a lot of really good stuff. And a lot of that, even years later, is still quite relevant today. And we're going to see in this presentation here. Okay, so what does it mean to be neuro-affirming? So this concept of being neuro-affirming, neurodiversity-affirming. Um, this is the idea that we are viewing neurological differences, such as autism or genetic difference or ADHD or dyslexia or a communication disability, um, as as a natural human variation rather than just as a disorder to be fixed. And that is sort of one of the key elements here, right? So this is part of the natural variability in the human genome, right? Rather than some kind of aberration or some kind of tragedy. And I think a really important component that the neurodiversity community talks about, and this is something I'll come back to a little bit in this presentation, is this idea that acting neurotypical is really not the goal, right? And I think that we could think about how there are therapies and ways, throughout history and presently, where that kind of is seen as the goal. But I think, again, a neurodiversity affirming approach and sort of attitude kind of rejects the narrative, and that, that these diagnoses are tragedies. Now, that does not mean that there's not valid feelings that should be taken seriously, when, people's lives become different than they imagined. And of course, there are challenges and that are important to understand, and people's feelings about it are important to understand. Um, but some of you may remember. I mean, I am maybe dating myself here, but this is in the 2000s, early 2000s, when in the autism world specifically, although this could be applied elsewhere, there was a lot of these sort of billboards about saying like, well, like autism has come to take your son away from you and robbing you of your lives, and all this sort of emphasis on, like these diagnoses being tragedies, right? And again, we're not pretending like there's not sort of challenges associated with them, and we're going to talk about that. But, I think the sort of, what a lot of the sort of, especially in the autism world, but again, this was happening everywhere, there was a bit of a backlash, like, hey, like this does not feel good. I don't want to be driving down the street and reading a billboard like saying that I am a tragedy or something. And parents weren't liking that either, right? So we saw sort of a bit of a backlash, right? So in a neuroaffirming approach, we're really asking, what does the child need to thrive, rather than sort of like what's wrong with them, like what are their issues that need to be fixed, right? But more like, well, how do we sort of understand both the challenges and the strengths simultaneously, right? We're not, again, in a neuro-affirming approach, I think sometimes it gets a little stereotyped in a way to say like, oh, well, it doesn't acknowledge, challenges and needs. Like, absolutely it does, right? And so we have a lot of advocacy within the neurodiversity community, to have better supports for families, better access to services, all these really important things. So yeah, I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. Um, so one of the kind of key concepts, I don't know if any of you have heard the phrase "nothing about us without us," right? So it's sort of like, how do we incorporate the views and of neurodivergent adults and who to sort of lead the way here, right? To kind of be leaders in the community, not just be sort of something that is that are taking a back seat, but really are in the front seat here, and sort of their views about therapies, about programs as being kind of front and center. And I always really recommend to families that, wherever you can find it, there's lots of this stuff available online that you can find pretty easily. Is that sort of really finding adults who share the same disabilities diagnoses as your child, and really listening to what they have to say. And that was, again, where my kind of interest in this started, I think, through my dissertation that really focused on that. Um, and again, coming to this idea of not just focusing on the challenges, but also focusing on the strengths. And people, it can be really easy to, people say have an autism diagnosis or a genetic disorder or a whatever disability one might come with. It's going to be easy to kind of list all of the challenges that the child has, right? The aspects of the diagnosis that are part of the criteria. Um, like really quickly, all of us, I think, parents, clinicians, society, we're all, can have a pretty good list of the challenge. We all kind of have a sense of what those are, most of us. But do we have an idea of what some of the strengths are? And this isn't just strengths of individual strengths that are personal and specific to your child, which are also, of course, really important to understand, that your kid might be really good at taking things apart and building things or something like that. That's a little specific. Your kid might be extra good at playing kickball or something like that. But what are sort of general strengths of neurodivergent folks that tend to actually be strengths when compared to the neurotypical population, which I think is interesting to make sure that we are also thinking about, right? So some things there, according to the research, some things that come to mind. And of course, these are generalizations, right? These aren't going to apply to every single person. But, in general, we see that there are strengths in pattern recognition, right? This is, again, a strength that goes beyond what a neurodivergent kid might be able to do. I'm sorry, a neurotypical kid might be able to do in terms of pattern recognition. We see some real strengths in that area. We see really incredible attention to detail in some cases. We see a deep focus, this ability to really sustain focus on interests and things that we might be passionate about. Sometimes this is referred to as monotropism. I don't know if anyone has heard that term, but this idea of, again, being able to really kind of dig in there when passionate about something. We see that there can be a really strong attunement to fairness and justice in this population, which is really important. We see strengths in memory, and in particular, long-term memory, memory for facts, scripts, routines, experiences, that again can be really quite impressive. And I think persistence, right? One sort of drive and persistence to get their needs met can really be a real strength here that we might be more likely to see among neurodivergent kids. So I think these are important to think about. Okay, so what are some of the key shifts that we want to think about in neuro-affirming care here, in neuro-affirming parenting, and how we want to sort of view this and where we want to, where we've been and the direction we're moving in and want to move in. So the first key concept is the idea, and I'll come back to this of won't versus can't. So this is the idea that are we viewing a child's behaviors that they won't come to circle time in their preschool class, or they won't come to the dinner table when it's time to eat? Or is it that they can't because it's too hard for them? Right. And so viewing these behaviors as like, oh, well, this is something that a child won't do might lead us to a response, one type of response from adults. Versus this is something the child can't do, and it's something that we need to find ways to support. So this is an important shift that we're going to come back to. This idea of moving from kind of control and comfort, right? This emphasis on, obedience and control of behavior, to more of a focus on comfort and connection as a precursor to self-regulation. It's an important concept. The idea of whole body listening, as versus anybody listening. So what I really mean by that is an example of how there might be kind of a social expectation to, sit in the circle time and look at the teacher and keep your body pretty still and you know um, uh, like kind of that might be the social expectation, right? Like we want to see your eyes, your ears, your body torn towards me, right? This is a common thing teachers do. Versus, well, actually, my child might be listening even when they're kind of bouncing up and down a little bit. They're getting up and moving back and forth. They're not really looking towards me. They're kind of fidgeting with something, but actually that's what my child needs. And I don't want to assume that they're not listening. And maybe in fact that supports them to listening. But again, the point being that there's not just one way to be that's okay, right? That there's ways to be that are maybe, again, they did not meet the adult's expectation at first, but we're thinking more broadly about that. So I think we see a shift from, a focus on external behavior, like the external behavior being the child won't come, put their shoes on to get out the house, versus their internal experience, what's happening for them internally that makes it difficult. And that being kind of the key question more than sort of what's this external behavior is. A shift from and I would say this is sort of refers to the adults around the child sort of being inflexible, right? I mean, we do talk about flexibility as a challenge within many neurodivergent kids, and sure, like that might be a growth area and an important area. But I think that when we meet inflexibility with from a child with equal parts inflexibility from the adult, who in theory and hopefully has the ability to be more flexible than the child does, um, that becomes a problem, right? So moving from, how do we as adults become more flexible in how we think about helping a child to grow and how we think about what our behavioral expectations should be. Again, flexible about thinking like, well, my circle time might look a little different here, and that's okay. I'm being a little bit more flexible about how I imagined circle time being here. Um, the concept of sort of not just sort of awareness of disabilities, right? So you hear this in the autism world a bit. This concept of like autism awareness versus autism acceptance, right? So there's a movement of like, well, it's not really just about awareness of it, right? But like, how do we actually, show acceptance to people with neurological differences, and how do we be more inclusive of them in society, right? So move from not just being aware of it, right, but actually truly accepting. Um, and a move from independence to interdependence. And I always qualify this for saying, like, it of course could be a reasonable goal for, if a young adult or a child to kind of do some things more independently because they want to do something more independently and we want them to, like, I'm not suggesting that independence is never a goal or a growth area that's important, but I do think sort of an overemphasis on independence can be problematic, especially if it's done at the expense of things that are harming the child. And we're going to talk a little more about that. So moving from independence to interdependence, right? We are all interdependent in some way or another, right? For the grocery store or whatever it is, right? We all need stuff from other people in some way. And yeah, some people might need more than others because again, there's natural variation of the human genome, right? And so how do we sort of, have some sort of acceptance of that? And then moving from thinking of kids and disabilities as being at sort of a fixed capacity versus a variable capacity, right? And this is one of the reasons why we see things like functioning labels, like high functioning versus low functioning, getting kind of tossed out in the neurodiversity community. And when people talk about neuro-affirming care, we think about like, well, who does that really serve? Like, how is that really helpful to call somebody low functioning versus low functioning versus high functioning, for example, right? So it's like, because someone who might be, identified low functioning in one context might be doing quite well in a different environment, and someone who's so-called high functioning might actually be really struggling and really not able to access any of their basic needs in another situation. And so these are not kind of fixed things. And so, so this is what we hear about that there's just really not, and I agree that there's really not a useful, it doesn't tend to benefit the person who receives the label. Right. And that is sort of, and again, it can sort of put people in kind of typecast them in a sense, in a way that like might not be accurate, right? That their abilities might be more fluctuating, more variable. So we'll talk more about that. And so what this really gets at is this shift from trying to change the child, like shifting from focusing on quote unquote remediating deficits to a focus on changing the system around the child. And this is kind of a critical concept that ties into the concept of a medical model of disability and how we think about disability again as sort of the person with the disability is in need of a fix, of a cure, of a remediation versus like, well, actually, the kid is just fine. It's like the systems around the kid that we need to be focusing. Like, how do we advocate for them at school? How do we make, the society more inclusive, right? That the problem does not exist within the child, but challenges are about broader systemic issues. And so that is sort of an important thing to think about, right? Like, how do we think about where the problem is located? Sort of a shift from, again, being located within the child is the problem versus now our understanding is the problem, our attitudes are the problem, our lack of, adequate parental support and parental leave and ableism and, discrimination. Like this is where the problem lies, not the fact that the child it has a disability, right? So kind of that is a really important shift that I think is important to talk about. And this concept of presuming competence, right? So this comes from there are some adults who had talked about their experiences, and these are some adults that are specifically speaking through AAC devices, who maybe are non-speaking or communicating, through typing, who have talked about how, like, yeah, I mean, I was not able to speak, but people used to always talk about me around me as if I didn't understand. Right. And so again, it's like, well, actually, we want to presume, I don't want to assume just because a kid is having a communication disability, I don't want to assume they're not understanding. I don't want to assume that they're not picking up things around me. Right. So it's sort of like we want to be more sensitive to that and ties in with this concept of presuming competence, viewing behavior as valuable communication, right? So it's not just like, oh, this isn't just some kind of thing to be extinguished, but this behavior, I want to take this seriously, because this behavior might be communicating something. And sure, we might need to find a different way for a child to handle their feelings, for example. But again, really, understanding behavior as communication. And tying with the concept of presuming confidence too is an idea, is this concept of like actually a lot of standard cognitive testing that, a school district might do, or your, whatever assessment one might have to establish a diagnosis, is really much more likely with many neurodivergent kids to underestimate their ability, right? So, like, for example, maybe a child isn't really, maybe once the child, like, kind of gets explained the instruction a few times, then we really see what they're capable of. But in the testing situation, maybe they were only explained the instruction once and they weren't really attending to it. But then how does that then later impact their scores? And, good assessors will, try to really say this in a report, right? For example, that, like, actually, I don't think that this is a really valid assessment of a kid's intellectual ability. But again, these are such testings. A lot of these testing situations are, it's just really hard to, I don't know, like, to see, it could be a couple hours or more. I mean, again, like, ideally, a good assessor will be breaking up this into small chunks if the kid can't handle it. But again, it's like the structure of assessment is like a poor cultural match for many neurodivergent kids who might need more than what the testing situation really provides. So, I think that it sort of just highlights a problem with testing and how we kind of make assumptions about a kid's abilities. And sometimes we're making assumptions about a kid's abilities based on that, which again can be problematic. And again, kind of trusting that this kid is, kids are making a genuine effort to do well. So this is a quote from a psychologist named Ross Green. This concept of children do well if they can. And this is in contrast to the statement, well, children do well if they want to, right? And so, which has maybe kind of historically been more of an approach. Again, it's implying intentionality, like, oh, if this kid just wanted to do better, they would do better. Which again, this is an important shift to kind of think about, well, what is sort of the underlying challenges, and that actually kind of trusting this kid is putting forth a genuine effort and wants to do well on some level, but isn't yet able to. Right. So this is again moving from not just what the behavior happened. I just recently, parent of a kindergartner, told me that the kid did, got an email from the teacher, or I think an administrator, about all these sort of difficult and challenging behaviors that the kid did, that week, like threw a pencil at somebody, ran out of the classroom, stuff like this. You all know what I'm talking about. Sort of challenging stuff, right? And just kind of listed all of the challenging stuff. And I do empathize as a previous teacher myself. Like, these are hard things to deal with, and we all gotta, think together about how to support the kid, for sure. Um, but but if we only are really talking about what happened, we actually don't really know what to do about it, right? It was much more important is to understand, well, why did this happen? What was going on for the child that led to this? And really kind of focusing on that. What are the underlying challenges that led to the child having difficulty? And there can be a lot, like, you could take any challenging behavior anytime a kid is having difficulty meeting adult expectations. So I have this example here, like, why won't my child come to the dinner table? Right. And again, like, as parents, life is hard. We want to keep the evening routine moving. Like, it is frustrating sometimes when your kid won't come to the dinner table, right? And like that, we want to validate that. Like, that is hard. It is frustrating. Of course it is, right? Um, but again, are we trusting that if this kid could do well in this moment, that they would? And what are the underlying challenges that might lead to that difficulty getting to the dinner table? And like, there's many. So I've listed some here. There's probably more, right? Is it the sensory experience? And we're talking a little bit more about sensory processing later today. Is it, excuse me, anxiety about not, I don't know, like, what's going to be at the table? I'm a little worried about that. Attentional switching from one task to the other, transitioning. This is the huge thing. There's really kind of like many neurodivergent kids of all kinds of diagnoses. This is a pretty common struggle, right? So again, we talked earlier about kind of the concept of hyper focus or monotropism, right? So maybe the kid is really kind of absorbed in, whatever little Lego thing they're doing. And yeah, like we might expect them to be able to just stop right before they're finished because it's dinner time and like we are human parents and want to just move things along, but our kid just might not be able to switch tasks, right? Or initiate the next task, right? Um, is this an issue of flexibility that, oh, the kid maybe had mac and cheese last night and thought they were having mac and cheese again this night, but it was hard, it was something, that they weren't really expecting tonight. So these kinds of things, right? Or maybe is it that the kid needed to be able to maybe be enticed to come to the table, or they needed to choose it on their own, right? So maybe their kid, so we see this sort of patterns of demand avoidance sometimes where kids who do not get to be the one to initiate, they need, is really hard to get them to kind of comply with the adult expectations, because they need to have a sense of control and choice. So this is an important concept to think about too. Excuse me. Um, and language matters. So, if you take, just to name some kind of common phrases, or terms maybe use like sort of rigidity, for example, right? Like, oh, like this kid is so rigid, right? It's like, okay, but can we maybe reframe that a little bit? That's sort of in a way that is a little bit more kind of empathy inducing. Like, okay, my child has a really high need for control and has a really difficult time when they don't feel that sense of control. Or my kid is just sort of like, just kind of repetitively doing this and this and this, right? So the language in the autism criteria, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity, right? It's like, okay, well, no, my kid has a tendency to be monotropic and really develop a lot of expertise and passion in these interests and toys and activities. Um, and maybe even something about like my kid, is bad at transitions, right? Like, yep, my kid really goes deep into their experiences, not rushing through things, not rushing through life, right? It's just like, I think just being conscious of the language we use to describe challenges, I think is important to shift in ways that are, I think it can bring about a little bit deeper understanding of the challenging behavior of the kid and actually more empathy from the adults around the kid. That is really important. And speaking of language, I just added this slide right before this presentation. And I don't know if there's any, I can't really see the participant list if there's any speech therapists in the audience here. But this kinds of Gestalt language processing is something that I will say for myself is more something that I have come to understand in more recent years compared to like the 2000s and the 2010s when I was uh like when I was sort of maybe learning more about this stuff. So this is the idea that some kids are going to learn language in chunks. They're going to memorize phrases maybe rather than sort of building speech word by word, right? And this idea that scripts are not meaningless, right? That like maybe this kid, it repeated something from a TV show they saw, but maybe actually that was kind of, maybe there was some meaning in that. Like, actually, I want to go out to the playground now, or oh, I need a break. And maybe that wasn't that obvious to us, but I mean, again, I think it's this idea of also like not thinking of things like echolalia as something to be like extinguished, right? Again, we're kind of thinking about like, okay, well, there's sort of neurological differences. This is a natural part of the human genome, and we want to sort of value and respect all forms of communication. All communication can be meaningful. So I thought that was an important thing to include. Another, I think, important concept in neuroaffirming care can be talking to your child about their diagnoses, talking to them about their neurotype, and starting early on. And your kid might not understand now, and that's okay, right? And but I think that what I do see there's sort of a common pattern that I think has been changing a bit, where I think parents sort of fear oh, if they know about their diagnoses, that it's going to have this and that impact. And I empathize. I think all parents come from a good place, but I do think that sometimes the stigma associated with disability diagnoses, like that really exists more in society and maybe in us as adults than it does in your child. Like they don't have the stigma, like that is not something that is just like inherent, right? And so that might be something that's learned over time. But I do think sort of, just kind of being open about, strengths and challenges and diagnoses early on, exposing kids to, again, adults who share similar diagnoses as your child does, really, I think is going to be important for one sort of self-esteem development. And ultimately, we want kids to understand themselves and their strengths and challenges and their diagnoses. And it gives an opportunity for them to know how to advocate for themselves at some points too. So I think it's another kind of important concept in neuro-affirming parenting. Um, there's a study, this was almost 10 years ago at this point, but it was a pretty important study from 0 to 3 where there's an organization working in early childhood where they really looked at in a pretty detailed way what parents' expectations were, what parents tended to believe their their children's abilities to be. And in this study, it was more than half felt like their child could manage their impulses and control their emotions and self-regulate more than they biologically should be able to, meaning it was neurobiologically kind of expected that this 4-year-old or whatever would not be able to control their impulses, but more than half of the parents thought that they should. Now, then this was a kind of a broad look at parents of all kinds of kids, not specifically neurodivergent kids. But neurodivergent kids, we know there's maybe extra challenges. There's brain differences associated with impulse control and self-regulation, right? So I think one of the key things that I think about is, how do we flexibly modify our expectations to meet kids where they're at? And that is not the same as saying, don't challenge your kid or don't expect good things from your kid. So I do think we, of course, want to help our kids to grow and to challenge them appropriately. But again, I think that we often see a lot of challenging behaviors come from kind of a mismatch between adult expectations and a child's ability in the moment. And one of the things that makes that very hard is that abilities can fluctuate up and down. Like, oh, yep, the last 2 days, my kid could come to the dinner table, but like now they're really struggling, right? So it can be extra frustrating. Like he can do it. He can turn off the iPad. Like he can, stop the Lego thing. I've seen it, but like not today, right? And how do we deal with that? How do we understand that? It's really important. So really thinking about what's your child's capacity, right? And so this is something that, a lot of parents come to me over the years, I have found, where they're sort of saying, I'm just like trying to think, we've got all this stuff that, I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to do OT and speech and this like early intervention program and 12 hours a week of ABA at home. And and then we have like your child's actual capacity that can be hard to know and understand, and sometimes that is a work in progress, right? And I do know that like there might be some kids that being at let's say an 8 hour a day or 7 hour a day preschool or something um might be too much for them, but like your work situation might be such that like it's not an option for your kid to have a half day, and that's just reality. And we can still advocate for those kids at school to how to reduce stress and how do we make this a little easier for them. So of course, sort of these practical situations in terms of, but again, thinking about, like what kind of time does your child have to explore their special interests? Like, are they so scheduled that, we would expect, I mean, sometimes actually kids with disabilities are expected to have less downtime than neurotypical kids. That is a problem. I think it's like just because, and again, I want to be clear, I am not anti-therapies. I am pro like individualizing this to your child and your child's needs and doing a pros versus cons analysis and really kind of seeing like, well, does my child actually need more time to explore whatever it is they're into? Do they need more downtime? What does my child's day look like? Should I, on a Thursday after a 4-day week, trying to make them do this one activity that they don't really want to do, like that just might be too much. And I find a lot of parents are kind of have like an intuition that something might be too much, but actually they're kind of looking for permission to follow their intuition, which again, I think parents have good intuition. That's I run across that time and time again. Um, so, I think that, and a lot of this might depend on the type of therapy, the type of relationship, that your child has with the therapist, right? So maybe, we want to keep the service that we got going because it took a while to get rolling. We finally have the OT or the speech person we want after some turnover. And, but can we? But I'm also kind of noticing it's like kind of helpful, but it's also kind of stressing out my kid. Are there ways that we can kind of advocate for maybe a more of a relationship focus? Maybe we're kind of gradually increasing challenges as opposed to going all in. So these are the things I think are important to think about. And this concept of spoon theory that I don't know if, maybe some of you have heard of this. So this was originally developed by it was originally talked about by actually just an adult with a chronic kind of autoimmune condition, I think lupus or something like that, where, they just really like, this was I think, I'm sure it was a parent who talked about how she could kind of get up and get her kids ready for school and get them out the door, but then like she had to like lie down for 6 hours after that. Like that was all she could do on some days or some weeks, right? Because that, but if she didn't deal with her, her kid, if somebody else was able to get the kids up and out the door, then she was able to work for a few hours or something, right? So it's this idea that like, this concept is certainly true for everybody, but it's going to be particularly true of neurodivergent folks that like, spoons is really kind of a metaphor for like units of emotional energy or mental wherewithal. Is sort of how I think about it. And so maybe, your kid has the spoons for, like they can do one recess period, but like if they go to the aftercare that is more unstructured, like that's really going to drain their spoons. And then they've got no capacity to do this other thing when it's time to get home. Or then, some of our expectations of them to, put their shoes away and not just leave them in the middle of the floor is like the kid has barely any spoons left. So like this becomes more challenging. So again, this kind of ties into this like, concept of sort of recognizing fluctuating capacity, um, and again, ties in this kind of recognizing when your child might be kind of like overscheduled, right? And so how can we think about that, right? And then what do we want to prioritize, right? Because we might only have a certain amount of spoons in a given week or a given day or a given month. And these things are cumulative. Like, the cumulative stress is a thing, right? So, for some kids, like they are going to do okay when the first few weeks of, I don't know, after a winter break. Some kids are going to have an extra hard time because it's a transition, but maybe they're kind of also like have a little bit more spoons and more bandwidth after a 2 weeks off of preschool or something. And then when it's time to go back, they've got some more bandwidth, but then maybe the cumulative stressors or is going to kind of hit that over time. And by the time it's almost spring break, everyone's just like kind of you know crawl into the finish line here because it just feels like it's been too much, right? So, this is going to be important to think about because these are not obvious things here. Sometimes it's not going to be obvious when our child is out of spoons. So I want to talk about, what I view as concerning practices. So that are, unfortunately, I would say a lot of this is still fairly mainstream, and I think in conflict with, what some of the messaging is out of, around neuroaffirming care. Um, so, the first thing I want to think about is what I would call the overuse of reward systems, right? So the use of reward consequence systems that, now, I specifically say overuse because I do think that there are going to be kind of some priority issues that, like, hey, we're not going to, do this thing you want to do until we brush our teeth or until something happens. Like, I do know that sometimes there is going to be a bit of this that is kind of just part of it, right? Like almost every school teacher uses some kind of behavioral reward system to get, desired behaviors from your kid. But I do say that what I call the overuse of reward systems as being a problem. So there's a lot of research to this, and I would recommend someone named Alfie Cohen, and I'll have I think I listed him at the end of this presentation in the resources section, um, who wrote a book called I'm forgetting what it's called. If anyone knows in the chat and wants to say the name of an Alfie Cohen book, let me know. Punished by rewards, maybe something like that. So there is this concept of how using words too much can really undermine intrinsic motivation. Then everything can become an exchange. No, I'm not like then you can't get your kid to do anything unless they're getting a reward. Or like the rewards don't work. And what do? You're kind of upping the ante. And I think sometimes we say, oh, this is the reward, not a consequence system. But in practice, not getting the reward is really experienced as a punishment to the child. And so, I do see this dynamic a lot, right? And again, like there might be some situations like I have absolutely bribed my child with a cookie so that she could like take her antibiotics for her ear infection or something. Like I mean, there are going to be times where like, you know, we might need to throw this in, but I do think we want to be thoughtful about how much we're doing it. And when it doesn't work, what is that like for your child when it doesn't work, right? And because if it didn't work to get what you wanted, again, we're assuming, well, kids do well if they can. So then are we kind of essentially giving the kid the experience of a punishment for doing something they couldn't do as a result of their disability? And that's a problematic dynamic. So one of the things that I also see as a concerning practice is this idea of hand over hand, right? So I remember in my early ABA days, like I was really instructed to do this. Like if you told the kid to, point to the red um the red card, let's say they're like writing colors, and you're saying point to the red card, and the kid doesn't do it, like the instruction to the ABA therapist like myself was to kind of hand over hand, just sort of like make the kid do the thing, like just do it, like take their hand and point to the red card. I think that the problem with that, as I see, is again, it kind of we do want to give kids the right to say no. I think it's a very risky thing when we are taking, as adults who are in a more powerful position, taking control of kids' bodies. Um, and and of course, there would be an exception of like your kid's about to run into the street in front of a moving car. Of course, we control their body there. I would grab them and keep them safe. This is different. So this is where we want to, be really thoughtful, right? Like we do know very tragically, and sad fact that um, kids with disabilities have a higher likelihood of abuse and maltreatment. We want to teach kids that their no means no, and that we want them to respect. we want to respect their bodies and their bodily autonomy. So it can be really, so this isn't a concerning practice that I still see. Um, Really common thing I see is the interpretation of behavior as attention seeking, right? Like, oh, he's just trying to get attention. Oh, she just wants attention. And typically this is used as a kind of a justification to ignore behaviors that are seen as attention seeking. Now, I think if your kid is trying to seek some attention, which I would actually rather call this connection seeking, I think is probably a better way to put it. Um, I think that's a difficult message. If your kid is distressed and you are ignoring them, like that might send a message that like, hey, I can't get my needs met. We would not do that to an adult, right? So why would we do that to a kid? I think that and what can be a very sad outcome is that a kid might actually just stop trying to get their needs met, right? Trying to get that. Because again, I would suggest it's not about getting attention. Maybe this kid needs some more, is anxious, needs some more kind of connection with the caregiver. Maybe this kid needs some more movement and we can, help them meet their movement needs in some way, right? And if we just interpret this as attention seeking, it's a very kind of surface level interpretation, we might be missing the mark about the underlying challenges that are there. Excuse me. Um, so this idea of pushing through sensory overwhelm is, I think we've done better overall, and I'm going to talk more about sensory systems in a bit. Um, but I do still think that there is a tendency, again, if we just say like, oh, well, he's running out of the class, because he wants attention, he wants to be chased. And if we assume that's the reason, but actually maybe, and so we're gonna, really push the kid not to take breaks from the classroom. But wait a second, what about the role of a sensory overwhelm? Are we inadvertently pushing kids through something that's actually really intolerable? And there are some things that we might want to push through in a way that is helpful. So, for example, if I have, some like social anxiety or something, and I'm worried that something terrible is going to happen every time I, go to some kind of party, like I might want to kind of push through a little bit and like still just, I would not suggest, oh, well, we just avoid going to the party, right? Like that would not be the right suggestion for me or for someone in that situation. But actually, maybe I do try to go to the party. Maybe I just go for half the time or something. Maybe I just go in the beginning when it's less people or something. So, like that's one thing. But when we're talking about where there's like a sensory based avoidance, we really don't want to be pushing kids past their comfort zones because that's going to be more harmful. It doesn't really work like that with a sensory issue. So whereas like pushing myself to go to the party might actually reduce anxiety overall, pushing your kid to stay in an environment where there's sort of a sensory overwhelm does not help their sensory sensitivities. In fact, it can overstress them, and kids that are overstressed are going to be even higher sensory sensitivities. Um, so that's another concerning practice. We also see, unfortunately, still, right, this idea of sort of like forcing eye contact, and that gets into that concept of like there are different ways to socialize, right? We don't want to assume like, oh, well, there's only one quote unquote right way to socialize. And like because again, like having a different way of socializing, we don't want to go at that of being like that way is wrong and this other way is right. Right, that is not the approach we're taking. And this idea of sort of like stimming behaviors, I'm not talking about stimming that's harming a kid or harming somebody else. I'm not just and I'm not suggesting that we don't address that, right? If there's a safety issue, of course we still address that. But much of stimming might actually be quite safe, might be a quite regulating activity for the kid, right? And so this is something that I do still see a lot, right? Is that we're just sort of immediately just trying to stop the kid from doing what they're doing when actually this has an important function for the kid that we want to value and take seriously. And there's a lot of phrases about about kids in general. This is not specific to kids with disabilities, but again, kids with disabilities might sort of be disproportionately and in higher amounts impacted by this. These phrases like, "Oh, they're just being manipulative. Oh, they're just being a brat. They're not going to survive the real world like this. They should know better. They're just being lazy. They need to learn who's in charge. Like, oh, just being dramatic, right?" You can kind of see how these kinds of adult interpretations of the reason why kids are the way they are is going to lead to problematic responses that are ultimately not helpful. And we do know that there are mental health challenges associated, like that are more likely among neurodivergent kids into adulthood, where there's a higher likelihood of mental health challenges, right? I think it's fair to say that when kids are misunderstood or when their behaviors, these underlying challenges are interpreted in these other ways, oh, they're just being lazy and manipulative and dramatic, that is not going to, that is going to be a contributor. I'm not suggesting it's the only thing, but it could be a contributor to mental health challenges. So we want to keep that in mind. Um, and again, it's this idea of like, how are we accepting the differences? How do we sort of framing this as the kid is having difficulty meeting neurotypical social expectations? Like that is what is happening often, right? And there's a autistic researcher named Damien Milton in the UK who did a bunch of studies and come up with this theory called the double empathy problem. And this idea that became kind of clear. So this is looking at autistic adults and non-autistic adults, where the issue was not that the autistic folks were not empathizing or not able to access empathy. It was actually went in both directions, that autistic people could understand and empathize with autistic people better, and non-autistic people could understand and empathize with non-autistic people better, but they're missing the mark, right? And this idea of like, this isn't just about trying to make your kid act and seem neurotypical. Like that is missing the mark, right? It doesn't really work. It kind of can lead to, it basically kind of can communicate that one's sort of performance is more important than like how authentic they are to themselves, right? And so this can lead to the concept of masking, which is this idea of sort of suppressing, these neurological difference in the effort to look quote unquote normal, which has mental health effects. So I think that's an important concept. And I really like to think of the concept of childism, which again affects all kids, is going to, kids with intersecting identities, disabled kids, it's going to impact them more. This idea that kids are inherently inferior and they need to be controlled. They are, this idea that kids are sort of basically not included. So this can, this idea of sort of discrimination of children is something that we don't really think about that much. But I think is important to think about in the context of neuro-affirming parenting, because it's going to particularly impact your kids. It's like, well, like maybe my kid is not going to sort of stay as quiet in the movie theater or on the airplane, but like getting nasty looks, from people. It's like, well, like we're doing the best we can here. And, maybe we need, like people to realize that like, we got to be a little more inclusive. How can we get the movie theaters to do something that's more inclusive? There's many ways we could think about that. But it's another important concept I like to think about, because this is really common in neurodivergent folks and in disabilities. This idea of the kids having like a very highly sensitive stress response system or hypersensitive neuroception. I don't know if anyone's heard that term, but it refers to an unconscious, it's a very automatic system for detecting threat or detecting when things don't feel safe. And that can be very turned up, right? So this is why can see high reactivity, strong emotional regulation challenges, low thresholds, low window of tolerance. So we see this is common. This concept of masking, again, this can be true of a 3-year-old or a 40-year-old neurodivergent person who maybe is again trying to kind of suppress their traits to please others and to act in socially acceptable ways, but at what cost, right? We talked about mental health costs. Um, and we do know that there are real neurobiologically based differences. These areas that help children, again, with attentional switching, thinking flexible, controlling emotions, self-regulation. These are really, common challenges that we want to make sure we're understanding. And I think in this sort of thinking about disability rights advocacy, we want to be thinking about, again, these mental health costs of the overemphasis on compliance, the right of people to say no, like, no, you can't force my finger to touch this red, square here. Like a kid might be communicating that by trying to run away or not doing that or ignoring you or fighting back. And we want to listen to that kind of communication. And then also this idea of, disabled folks having input into the designing goals of therapy, right? That it's not just what, maybe, the child's parents wants, but also we're trying to take into account what a kid wants. And of course, there are exceptions. And of course, there are ways that we might be adding goals as parents that is not something the child would come up with. But again, we still are taking the kid's needs and preferences seriously. And how do we incorporate that into a broader program? And the right to self-determination, like what does this person want? Like this is something that should not just be applied to neurotypical folks, but it should be applied to everyone. And I don't think even though it's been probably 40 or 50 years since we've kind of had an increased understanding of like sensory processing, maybe less than, maybe sort of the 90s that this started kind of getting a little bit of steam here. Um, in the grand scheme of things, it's actually not a long time. 30 or 40 years or something is not really a long time. And I think that this is something that is still not adequately understood as an underlying challenge that I think is really key to being a neuro-affirming parent is to understand how does your little one, what kinds of sensory input are they quite reactive to? What kinds of sensory input do they crave? Like are they overstimulated by the sights and sounds of the world? Do they have a high need for physical input to their body, or the kids are bouncing or spinning, and and this again, are we viewing this as a kid who's just kind of being difficult and not sitting still because they just want attention, or because are we viewing this as a kid who's just being oppositional because they're oppositional, or are we viewing this as a kid who's kind of on a neurobiological level has some kind of movement needs or has some kind of sensitivity that is just not going to be super obvious. And the triggers are there, right? I think that we talk about the most common triggers, right? I mean, there's just so many things. It's too crowded, it's too hot, my clothes don't feel right. And this stuff might be happening to kids who have difficulty communicating that they're feeling this way. So again, we want to be really careful and sort of assuming that they are just being dramatic or just being manipulative when like they might have trouble even knowing their own bodies or communicating their needs, speaking in general, right? But like these still might be very, common triggers for some kids, like too much, the smell of dinner is too much, so I can't come to the table. The lights in this preschool classroom are too much, right? So how are we really kind of getting a nuanced understanding of our kids' sensory system is really key. And probably the most common thing that I come across is challenges with emotional regulation, right? This is like the most common thing that parents come to me, concerned about for understandable reasons, right? And I like this image, I like this graphic because it really talks about how um, for me the visual is helpful is it really is sort of saying like, okay, we've got here at the beginning of this, um a kid is more regulated, they're engaged, they're attentive, then maybe there's some subtle signs of dysregulation. Now this is something that is really key because once we get to the top of this mountain here, the full meltdown, the yelling, the crying, things feeling out of control, the fight or flight behavior, there's really not much we can do in that moment. I mean, we can try to ensure safety for yourself and others. We can try to, model our own self-regulation. But, typically once we hit that point, then is very hard to kind of suddenly kind of come back to a regulated place. Like really, this kind of has to run its course. And it can be a goal that we shorten the amount of time, and that might be an important goal. But also, I think this important goal is like, how do we try to prevent ourselves from getting there in the first place? I think is really important, right? So, how do we reflect on what works in that moment, right? Like, if I institute a consequence in that moment, is that going to worsen the situation? Maybe. Um, I think that, some parents use this example who are maybe they're neurodivergent themselves. We know this is a genetic, this is largely genetic. So like maybe the same kid that has big feelings, and can be quite loud, maybe that same parent has their own sensory sensitivities. And so like, how do I, use a strategy for myself if I have my own sensory sensitivities as a parent in order to handle this hard moment better? I think that could be really important, right? I think that when we get really worked up and we're triggered ourselves and we're upset, I do think it's important to think about like, well, how was I parented? Like, what would have happened to me if I was like what my child is doing? Oftentimes, I hear a response like, "Oh, it would have been worse, would have been not good." But I think that like we kind of carry with us, like our own experiences of being parented, whether we want to or not. We kind of carry that with us. And I think this is worth really reflecting on, being intentional around, am I acting the same way? Am I being treated the same way I was treated? What was that like for me? Are you able to model self-regulation for your child? Is a really important consideration. And what's your own bandwidth, right? I mean, and this is something that is easy to say, like, oh, create more bandwidth for yourself. Really hard to do. But noticing, like, oof, I am not in a place where I'm going to be able to tolerate this meltdown very well. So, is there anything I can do to just give myself a little bit more today? Or just buy myself a few more minutes here. Um, so I do think it's like it's not just your child, to use the example of zones of regulation, which is like, green is calm, yellow is starting to get anxious or agitated. Red zone is full blown meltdown, yelling, screaming. That's an oversimplified version, but I'll just stick with that. Looking at not just for your kids, and because that's when yellow zone, you're going to be more likely to be able to use some strategies to redirect or something than you are in the red zone. But also your own yellow zone signs. Your own yellow zone signs are important to know. Catching yourself before you're in the red zone, buying yourself time. And I think reminding yourself, excuse me, that there's nothing you can do in those escalated moments. Like your child is not in their thinking brain. Like really, it's very tempting to try and teach and impart your wisdom and knowledge to your child about how they should think about the problem differently, how it's not a big deal, as big a deal as they think, or how like that kind of behavior is not acceptable. Of course, we want to convey all that. Of course, we don't want our child to throw a pencil at their sibling. But we also actually need to be thoughtful about like, well, what is my child taking in that moment, right? And again, sort of going to that relationship first mentality. Kind of prioritizing the connection with them over kind of getting some kind of compliance in the moment. Really thinking of these things as a learning experience for the next time, right? So like it might be that like, you know, to take the example of punishment, we actually have really robust evidence from many decades of research showing that punishment and consequences do not work to change behavior in any kind of robust and lasting way. They might get you some temporary compliance out of fear, but has not actually solved problems in any kind of robust way. It's more, I think, just something that we all as parents might do to get through a hard moment. We're feeling a lack of control, but you're not really, it's really through strong and close relationships and through collaborative problem solving over time that kids learn to regulate. It's not because they were punished. Like that's not the difference between whether they learn self-regulation or not. But and which is why I really recommend these hard moments, thinking of them as a learning experience the next time. Okay, I realize that next time I need to tell my kid not to expect mac and cheese and give him more of a primer because it's just like he's going to expect it every day, this week unless I do this. Or, oof, okay, I know next time when, it's been there was a change in the schedule and like there was a little, I don't know, a little holiday thing at my kids' preschool. And, that my kid's kind of coming home overstimulated. I know that like maybe I need to keep him and his sibling separate because it's just going to be too reactive, right? Like, and this doesn't mean that it was your fault for not doing it because we are just doing the best we can. But again, thinking of these as learning experiences. And it's so important to think about this concept of hidden disabilities because there's some disabilities that are quite visible, like if someone's in a wheelchair or somebody has a seizure or something like a seizure disorder. I mean, this might be kind of more visible in a way, right? But for some kids, there really are like invisible stressors that are happening to them that we might not know, either because they can't communicate or it's kind of out of sight, out of mind they're not, or it's just hard for us to know, right? But I think sometimes our role becomes like a stress detective when there's challenges. I think this is a really important concept. And I do think that society tends to judge these invisible disabilities more, right? Because if your child's disability is that they have a seizure disorder, and he had a seizure, and people view that, like you're going to be met with empathy. You're going to have maybe, someone's going to bring like a pillow if it's a big seizure, like a pillow so to make sure they don't hit their head. Let's just get through this moment and keep everybody safe. Everyone's kind of empathizing. But if your kid's disability is like a self-regulation, fight or flight, lashing out, no empathy for that. But it's still a disability. It still links to brain differences that are not the child's fault. And so this is an important thing to think about. And, like how do we sort of make like understand what the underlying challenges are so that they're more visible? And how do we get to this just right challenge, right? So this is a concept from an OT named Gene Ayers in the early 70s. This idea of like something that is not too hard, not too easy. Like having achievable challenges for the kid. The thing that is sort of really common because of disabilities is that we might just like not quite strike the right balance. And it's harder. It's because the some of these disabilities are invisible. And that's really, really challenging to get to the just right challenge. But if we can kind of, again, have a more nuanced understanding of the underlying challenges, like then we can kind of meet the child where they're at. And there's so many barriers to all of this, guys. It makes it so hard, right? Like our emphasis on capitalism. We must be productive. We must, finish tasks. We must, make money, like all these things. It's like really hard, right? Because this is going to be concepts that are going to apply differently to different people, to people with disabilities, right? We know that many parents, there's a very understandable fear of the future, like which I think is a valid and deserves empathy and processing and discussion. And when we bring that fear of the future into the present moment, we tend not to be benefiting anyone, even if that's a valid fear. Um, we know that mainstream parenting advice, like maybe, my child's grandparents might think, that they should be able to just come to the dinner table when asking, and this is what you do, and that like might not work for your kid, right? And that's really hard to like live in that, where again, sometimes the challenges are not so obvious, right? And I think that sometimes we think that in order to be a good parent, our kid must be perfectly compliant and do everything we say. And sure, we all want that, right? And sure, but But actually, you can still be a good parent even when you're sort of recognizing, like, actually, my child just, it's not that they won't do it, they just can't do it right now. So I do think that it's important for parents to understand their own neurodivergence. Where's your own, if that's relevant for you, what your own, fears are of the future, as I mentioned. Understanding the hidden stressors, again, sort of striving for that just right challenge. I like this concept of stretching, but not overstretching, right? And different parents are going to have different levels of tolerance for this, of like, hey, I just can't take it that my kid, is not kind of working on writing their name or something. And, that can be tricky to navigate. But again, this concept of can we use some collaborative problem solving with a school team maybe, or even with a non-speaking child, you can use collaborative problem solving because you could, if you're using their behavior as communication, that can be really important. So I'm just going to run through briefly because we're getting towards the end here. Just a few therapies that I think are important to focus that I think are more neuroaffirming, and just general approaches and attitudes. I mentioned that Ross Green quote, "Kids do well if they can." He's a psychologist who wrote the book The Explosive Child. His approach called the CPS model, collaborative and proactive solutions, I think is a really good approach that I recommend. Again, attunement to sensory issues. Again, I support therapy, but we have to think about, in different types of therapies for sure. We need to think about an individual kid. Is this a time where your kid might just need to be the only group that they're doing is more shared interest, not social skill specific? Maybe that's what's best for your kid in some way. I really like the low arousal approach, which is sort of this idea of sort of managing the stress, not the behavior. So again, it kind of gets into like, how do we sort of get a little deeper into, the underlying challenges of the stress that leads to challenging behaviors, sort of going back upstream. And I think in a way that's really useful. Um, so as I mentioned earlier, do have a background in a DIR floor time approach. And I'll just say briefly that, this DIR sort of developmental individual differences, relationship-based approach. So this idea of individual differences really refers to nuanced understanding and taking account of your child's sensory system, which we already talked about. We also talk about like kind of a focus on the relationship as sort of the primary vehicle through which your child is going to learn and communicate and self-regulate. So it's emphasizing your connection with your kid. And I think that in the developmental play-based approach that it really lets the child take the lead in following their interests in a way that is really more than I think a lot of other behavioral approaches like ABA. Um, and it really kind of gets into this really neuroaffirming concept of that Dr. Greenspan was the name of the clinician, he's a child psychiatrist, who has sort of developed the DIR model. He used to talk about like loving their idiosyncrasies. Like, and this is pretty progressive at the time, of sort of saying like, you know what, maybe we're stimming with them. Like maybe we are, again, maybe this is a source of connection, right? Maybe this sort of, entices my child into like a warm, playful back and forth communication. It might be the goal to have some back and forth communication. It's like, how do we go about that? And I think that he would talk about this in a much more affirming way. Um, and then briefly, a few notes on parent well-being. I don't know if some of you remember this, but about a year and a half ago, or maybe almost 2 years ago now, the Surgeon General at the time, Vivek Murthy, um, basically like said that parenting is like essentially a public health crisis right now. Like the amount of parents who are reporting, and this was not specific to parents, to disability. This is not specific to neurodivergent kids. This is just in general. That parenting, like parents are reporting way more overwhelm, way more difficulty getting through the day, way more burnout, way more sense of isolation. And then this is, of course, going to be extra true for parenting neurodivergent kids. Because as you all know, there's just going to be extra layers, extra everything, extra hypervigilance, so that like, is a problem going to happen? Like, am I, the advocacy to get the therapies or the school support set up? There's going to be an increase in the social judgment and the isolation that can come with that. And of course, there's joys, and you love your kids more than anything, and have these joyful moments. And it's challenging. There's the grief that this wasn't how I imagined things, right? And I think we have to allow. I think one can be both neuro-affirming and allow themselves to acknowledge the feelings that are there at the same time. It's really important to kind of like not think like, oh, well, I'm not allowed to feel sad that like we can't do a vacation, all four of us together, because it's just too much right now. But feeling sad means I'm not neuro-affirming or something. No, like, you are allowed to have feelings. In fact, trying to suppress feelings does not actually work. And so we need to actually kind of find people. I know this can be hard, that you can trust, that you can allow, like, really kind of have your show your feelings to, show some vulnerability to. And I think that we're just reminding ourselves that you're doing a great job, that the problems are not within you or your child. The problems are within broader structures, broader systems that don't give enough family leave, that don't have enough special ed resources in the early intervention program, that don't have enough clinicians. Like, these are broader systemic issues. That's where problems are located. It's not in you as the parent or you as your child. And sometimes this is why I don't even really use the word self-care, because I think it's kind of like a lot of parents are like, I don't have time for that shit. What are you talking about? Like, and I get that. I get that. So, but maybe you have time for just 1 minute of just like a little mindfulness exercise, just checking in with yourself. Where am I at? Maybe you can take 1 minute here and there, a couple times a day, just to kind of like, reset yourself or ground yourself a little bit. Um, some parents feel supported by actually engaging in advocacy or community action, in finding groups online and otherwise to do that. Some parents who have a hard time asking for help, I do feel like once they kind of can, turn a corner, and maybe get something that they didn't realize could help. People are starting to realize like, we really need to support each other as families these days. Like, things are hard out there. And I do think that finding that community of like even just one or two or three people that you can be vulnerable with. I run parent groups as part of my practice. It's one of the things I do. And one of the things that time and time again that people are say that they really want in a group is not so much the problem solving. Maybe there's a little bit of that. Maybe there's a little bit of the educational stuff. Sure, like a little bit of that. But what they really want is like to not be judged because they had no intention of buying a toy when they went into the store for your kid, but you didn't want your kid to have a meltdown and you bought the toy. They just want to not be judged for that. And that's like really reasonable to want that, because you are making all these difficult cost benefit decisions all the time. So I think I'm going to end on that. I'm going to have some resources listed here: the Autistic Self Advocacy Network, Therapist Neurodiversity. Um, I do have Alfie Cohn's info here. Mona Delahook, really, she really talks about that concept of the why behind behaviors. Um, but I think I'll open it up now to any questions and comments and thoughts. And all of that. And I'm gonna like be able to look through the but so for questions, I think if there's a raise hand function, go ahead, Christina.
Thanks so much. So
You're welcome.
yeah, we're gonna go ahead and just pause for a moment. I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can get started with the Q&A. And thank you. I feel like so empowered to go out and, parent in this neuro-affirming way. Like, it's really exciting to hear so much about it. Thank you, Dr. Klein.
Welcome. I might just